In life, there are two kinds of people: those who put up with things and those who rebel against them. When he was a human being, Void did both of those things, but it was the latter that turned him into what he is today. His rebellion wasn't wrong by any means. He had a justifiable reason for his actions, but in the end, he became an agent of evil and Berserk's most enigmatic character without a shadow of a doubt. If we know nothing about the Skull Knight, then we know even less about Void, but that doesn't mean we know nothing. Throughout the series, we've received several hints at what led to him becoming the God Hand he is, and in this video, we're going to put them all together to take a comprehensive look at his entire life. So, without further ado, let's get right to it. The Sage of the Berserker King, Void's first life, and why he became a God Hand. For a long time, we had absolutely zero information about Void's past, save for the fact that he has some sort of history with the Skull Knight. That much is clear from their stare down in chapter 88. However, now that we're in what feels like the penultimate arc of Berserk, we have a lot more information with regards to who he might have been and why Skull Knight has beef with him. You see, shortly before his passing, Miura-sensei gave us one of the greatest gifts with regards to deciphering the overall story of Berserk, chapter 362. Kentaro Miura was a master of layered storytelling, often hiding information deep within the surface of his pages, making patterns repeat themselves over and over again, and yet somehow having them feel fresh as daisies. That's the mark of a genius storyteller. Miura's talents went well beyond his artistic contributions. Whenever he was asked to comment on the story of Berserk, he'd call it a 1,000-year-old epic. And the reason chapter 362 is so important is because it makes that comment make perfect sense. Ever since the golden age of the series, we've been drip-fed information regarding the distant past of Berserk and how it's being repeated in the present in a cycle that is seemingly inescapable. It started in chapter 53, when Princess Charlotte gave Guts and his group a history lesson on Midland and the Tower of Rebirth, aka Griffith's prison. There, we learnt that the Kingdom of Midland used to be the City of Midland, and the City of Midland was the capital of the only man to have subdued all mankind under his fist, Supreme King Geyserik. He did so by crushing his enemies on the battlefield with such ruthlessness that he gained nicknames like the Demon King or the King of Galloping Death, but he also sported a skull-shaped war helm when he rode into battle, so that probably contributed to it as well. After creating an empire, the likes of which has never been seen again, the Skull King proceeded to rule it into ruin. Most classical civilizations do, and eventually God himself smote him by sending his angels to destroy his capital city. In a single day, the greatest marvel in the world was gone, and its remains were buried underneath the Tower of Rebirth. The story was presented as half a fairy tale to us, but turns out it was closer to a nightmare that was real, because at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth, we find both the remains of Geyserik City and its citizens, all marked with the brand of sacrifice. Now, given the time frame of this event, it makes sense why Miura classified his story as a 1,000-year-old saga, and he peppers in clues to that effect later on as well. In chapter 138, we're told of a story about a sage who once called out Geyserik's, let's call it, excess. He proclaimed the Supreme King's indulgent sins to any and all who would listen to him. In an empire that stretches across the globe and has thousands of different tribes and cultures of humanity being held together by a single person, that kind of dissent tends not to fly for too long. The sage was captured shortly after he began his preaching, but it's what comes next that makes this entire thing feel a bit too familiar to the current timeline of Berserk. Instead of keeping him imprisoned with dignity in a place where he could no longer spread his message, Geyserik had him tortured within an inch of his life to send a message of his own. This is pretty similar to what the King of Midland does to Griffith 1,000 years later, except he has more of a leg to stand on than his alleged ancestor. Geyserik had the sage tormented in ways that even Mosgus wouldn't use, only for the sage's proclamations to finally reach God and rain down retribution on the Skull King. The chapter states that the heavens parted and an angel was made to descend, which we now know to be void. In the lead-up to the incarnation ceremony, Skull Knight constantly kept muttering to himself that all was flowing as if parallel to that time. In chapter 142, he shows up to check on Guts 2 years after saving him from the eclipse and christening him with the name Struggler. He comments on Guts' good health, which is said in poor taste if you ask us, and informs him that their paths converge this time around as well. Skull Knight tells him that where they're headed, an apostle lies in waiting, perhaps their leader even. He deduces that the gears of fate have been put into motion when he realizes Casca has run off to St. Albion, and he informs Guts that what's about to happen isn't something either of them can stop. The God Hand won't be physically present at the Tower of Conviction. Being a massive body of concentrated thought, they exist everywhere. Still, once in 1,000 years, the concentration of blood and negativity in a place reaches a mass critical enough to allow one that exists in the divine domain to alight in the physical world. He calls this a parallel to the eclipse, an attempt to imitate its process, which, unlike the actual eclipse, can't be interfered with as it has no physical basis. The eclipse occurs in the physical world, pulls those within its scope into the astral world. The incarnation ceremony is its opposite. It starts off in the astral world and ends with the physical incarnation of a God Hand member, so trying to alter it from the physical world was pretty much useless. Because it's such a massive ritual, it takes place once in 1,000 years. Besides, this is something that already was. Skull Knight calls the incarnation ceremony a reflection of moonlight from the other world, cast by a distant dying sun, and at first we thought this was just his cryptic way of describing things. The foe of the Inhumans has a particular way with words that usually flies over Guts' head, because he prefers his speech to be plain and direct. He gets frustrated with his supposed allies' "we lie within the causal current" attitude, because he was living proof that said current wasn't set in stone. Zod predicted he'd die during the eclipse, and Skull Knight did too, but he's still alive, and so is Casca. Skull Knight takes his point and decides to gamble his all on the brief moments of unpredictability created by leaping fishes like Guts. But just a few chapters later, we'd learn his ruminations were less cryptic and more literal. As the incarnation ceremony begins and the blood flow of the dead threatens to engulf everything in the St. Albion region, Skull Knight focuses on defending Luca from the apostle responsible for it all. Egg of the perfect world. Up until chapter 158, he had no idea how the God Hand was going to incarnate one of their own into the world. He just knew that it was going to happen, and its location. But when he sees the egg of the perfect world's behelit-like body, everything becomes much clearer to him, and he gets even more anxious to try and prevent the worst outcome possible. He manages to save Luca from the Apostle's lair and bring her to safety, but by that time, St. Albion is already tearing itself apart. The incarnation ceremony is well and truly underway, and all he can do is tell her to stay away from the tower. But she runs right towards it, determined to save Nina, with the bearing of someone off to tend to a trivial matter. Skull Knight thinks it to be ignorant foolhardiness or inspirational courage, but even if she asked for his help, he wouldn't be able to do anything, because just then, Zod arrives to demand his attention. As he draws his blade to engage his old foe, Skull Knight says to himself that all flows as if parallel to that time. You realize he isn't talking about eclipses anymore. He's talking about the day his entire life was destroyed. Well, technically, that'd be the first eclipse, and based off Skull Knight's own admission, the first incarnation ceremony as well. But for a long time, this was just speculation, until chapter 362 came out. In that chapter, we see Guts experience a blood memory seeped into the Berserker armor as a warning about overusing the thing. This blood memory belongs to the previous owner of the armor, who, at this point in the story, was confirmed to be Skull Knight. In that vision, Guts sees his spiritual predecessor cut down by a bunch of proto-apostles in a landscape that looks like a city block covered in abyssal matter. The abyss itself lurks within the background, and as Skull Knight makes his way to the closed altar in the distance, he finds himself face to face with Void, a bunch of as yet unidentified demonic-looking beings. He looks down to find his lover, marked with the brand of sacrifice, dying in his arms, just as a bigger manifestation of the symbol covers his capital city in a blazing conflagration. It's no coincidence that the chapters that preceded and succeeded chapter 362 gave us the most context on what happened 1,000 years ago, and who the Wandering Wraith really was. We learn that Skull Knight was a part of Elfhelm society as Geyserik. That his current existence was thanks to the dwarf blacksmith Hanar, who made him his iconic armor. We learn that Guru Gedfring knew him back when he was still a human. Remains of his lover were buried on Elfhelm. Guts thinks that Skull Knight was like him, and that what he'd seen in the memory was an eclipse, but he was only half right. What he'd seen was the first time a human crossed over to the divine realm, and that human was none other than Void. Now that we have all the important pieces to the puzzle, we can finally lay down what we think happened all those centuries ago. We know that Skull Knight was Supreme King Geyserik, and that as Geyserik, he used the Berserker armor to secure his continental empire. We know that eventually the armor began eating away at whatever conscience he had at the beginning of his reign, causing him to become a tyrannical and, by his own admission, foolish king. And we know that the only thing that can activate a Behelit, especially one as powerful as the Crimson Behelit, is making a sacrifice that severs one soul from their body and makes them give up everyone they love in this world. So, here's what we think went down. Before reaching Elfhelm, Supreme King Geyserik was just a human with an inhuman ambition to unify the entire world under his banner. Once he got there, he became friends with the mages and other supernatural creatures of the island, falling in love with the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms. He eventually acquired the Berserker armor and used it to fulfill his dream, but the armor ended up corrupting him, exposing his darkest parts and trying to cement them his sole truth. Geyserik's behavior as king drove many of his former supporters away from him, except his core group, which probably included Flora as well. But one day, he crossed a line that one of his closest allies could no longer abide by, and that's when he condemned him to unimaginable torture. That ally was Void. Once he began mistreating Void, that's when the rest of his supporters must have lost their trust in him as well. It's rather telling that Flora was shocked Skull Knight, of all people, would fight for her in her final moments for her to be at peace, because in his previous life, he fought only for himself. That must have become even more evident in his final years as Supreme King, because fairy tales are not all fictitious, at least not in the world of Berserk. They have a spiritual and historical basis, so when we're told that Geyserik's empire declined into depravity in those days, we can take that as the overarching truth. Guts. In a way, Geyserik was the proto-Guts, with Griffith's ambition in him, and Void was the proto-Griffith, playing Guts' role. He must have been crucial to Geyserik's establishment of a continental empire and his capital in particular, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to use them as sacrifices. The way that whole deal works in Berserk is you give up those who define your humanity in exchange for power and truth, and Void wouldn't have become a god hand if he wasn't close to Geyserik, crucial to establishing his empire, just like Guts was meant to be for Griffith. Because he's already a sage in the oldest stories about him, it isn't too much of a stretch to think he might have been a sorcerer from Elfhelm, especially one closer to traditional witchcraft like Granny Volvaba. With his power, the Skull Knight knit together his realm. For a time, they ruled over the greatest territory in known history. But soon, the Berserker armor clawed its way into Geyserik's psyche, and that's when everything went downhill. Just because he'd united all humanity under his banner didn't mean that Geyserik had all of their support. Rebellious elements are bound to exist within any faction due to humanity's core desire for freedom. That means that his war didn't end with his conquest, and if Geyserik did perceive things from that lens, then he would have kept using the Berserker armor way past the duration he needed to use it. We've already seen what prolonged usage of that thing does to a man's mind, and though they were allies, Geyserik was still Void's king and ruler. By speaking out against him, Void defied him and earned himself a lifetime of torture. While he was in the Tower of Conviction, speaking every prayer and incantation he'd learnt to survive his horrific mutilation, Void had a moment of clarity. He realized that things like balance and justice couldn't exist in a world forged by blood. Geyserik might have turned to the dark side, but he used to be a great ruler at one point in time. At least, that's the impression we get from Gedfring, who recalls Geyserik's village audiences with a fondness that a man who had been wronged by him simply wouldn't have. We also see Hanar greet Skull Knight with a bitter familiarity, claiming that he was still prattling around in the coffin he built him. Both of them addressed him as the King or His Majesty, which makes it very clear to us that they've known him since he was Geyserik, and they don't begrudge his presence. But because they've technically never left Elfhelm, they haven't seen just how much grief he spread in the outside world. Void did, and his observations caused him to realize that only a power greater than Geyserik's could put an end to his madness. Through his Evil acts. Void came to perceive evil as being the only true guiding force in the world, because by the end, all of Geyseric's actions would have been motivated by negative feelings. The Berserker armor and his refusal to relinquish it created a powder keg situation that was blown to Kingdom Come when Geyseric imprisoned Void. From that moment onward, we imagine the first eclipse as having proceeded in much the same way as the incarnation ceremony, only its effects were reversed. The Abyss was summoned to the physical world so the two could be separated, and Void's body of flesh was subsumed within the astral plane. Skull Knight's rumblings about parallels make a lot more sense when you consider the fact that the incarnation ceremony pretty much played out exactly like his eclipse, with this outcome being the only tangible difference. There was a mass sacrifice conducted outside the Tower of Conviction 1,000 years ago as well, where Void was imprisoned before he became a god hand. Skull Knight was caught up with something else when the ceremony was triggered, leaving his lover defenseless and near the core of the problem. The current timeline, that something was Zod, and the person that got away from him was Luca, who symbolically fulfills the role of the Lady Priestess. By the time he caught up with the objects of his ire, it was too late because his city had been engulfed by a massive brand of sacrifice, and though St. Albion didn't disappear with the incarnation, it might as well have been wiped off the face of the earth. The Tower of Conviction collapsed where the Tower of Rebirth was erected to hide the massacre that occurred 1,000 years ago. The incarnation sacrifices weren't branded, but they might as well have been. We can keep on going for days with respect to the many parallels between these two events and their core characters' stories. But all this is to say that Void felt the same betrayal that Griffith felt when Guts left him, except in his case, it probably rang truer. When he couldn't separate Geyseric's evil acts from the man he used to know, he gave in to evil himself and became the first human embodiment of that concept. The beings flanking Void in Chapter 362 could be an earlier iteration of the God Hand, as a lot of the Berserk community thinks, but if you've been with us for a while, you know who we think they are. Miura was born in the Chiba Prefecture, which is one of the first places Buddhism took root in Japan. A lot of his elemental magic is derived directly from the Godai school of philosophy, to the point that his description of the elemental functionalities of salamanders, gnomes, undines, and sylphs matches the Godai descriptions of fire, earth, water, and wind down to the last detail. But as you might have noticed, this philosophy is called Godai, which means the 5 great elements. While the 4 kings of the world are personifications of the aforementioned elements, we'd never seen an elemental king of space until we saw Void using Portal no Jutsu in Chapter 88. In the real world, the 5th element was birthed thanks to mankind's elusive chase for that which lay beyond the eye. Many cultures refer to an ether, a quintessence, an akash in their scriptures and myths, but this 5th element can be interpreted as being nothing more than space itself. In Godai philosophy, this is represented by Ku, aka empty space, aka the Void. Miura himself spelled his character's name not with the proper noun sensibility of the word void, but by using the kanji that described the concept of empty space. Relativity and cause and effect are 2 of the central themes of Berserk, so it makes sense that the God Hand possesses powers relating to the space-time continuum. As Femto, Griffith seems to have control over external space and gravity, which is one of the foundational forces of the universe, birthed by the interaction between objects in space and the fabric of space-time. Void, being the first God Hand member, has control over space itself, and this can explain why he ended up a part of the astral world when he was technically incarnated within the physical world. During Geyseric's age, magic was commonplace on Earth, gods and spirits much easier to invoke. Void, taking on the nature of a demon, wouldn't have necessarily caused the physical and astral worlds to separate unless he used his powers to make it so. If Void was in fact the 5th elemental king of space and the first demon king of the God Hand, then it wouldn't be out of the purview of his abilities to pull off such a thing. After all, it did happen shortly after the downfall of Geyseric's empire, and the corpses at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth are the only proof of his involvement in it. In Chapter 362, we see the Abyss lurking in the background, much like its momentary manifestation during another key moment in Berserk's timeline, which occurs 1,000 years later. It's very possible that after gaining control over the concept of space itself, Void chose to be locked up in the depths of the astral world, separating it from the physical. In a way, he'd be preventing a major catastrophe from repeating itself, because by doing this, he ensured that a second Geyseric could never emerge. The Skull King's legends portray him as a supernatural warrior who took his empire with blood and brutality, but we know that he got a lot of help from the mages of Elfhelm. Under Geyseric's rule, magic and mankind coexisted, however brief that coexistence might have been. But because it came from Elfhelm, it was good, and therefore beyond the control of evil. When he accepted the idea of evil's bargain for power in exchange for his life, Void attained enlightenment. He realized that the idea of evil was the thing that spun the threads of every human's fate, weaving them together to create reason out of their suffering. When he understood that his destiny and that of the world were one and the same, Void rose to the occasion, committing his severely tortured self to the idea's service. He's the only God Hand member that pretty much retains his look from before his ascension, because to him he saw God after his eyes had been sewn shut. The moment of rebirth is a significant spiritual moment, but more so for one who was already a sage. Void was pulled to the core of a concept that most of his peers could only perceive the edges of, and for that he was grateful. He accepted the idea's ideology as his own and proceeded to split the two worlds because by doing so, he'd reign supreme in one of them. As the direct agent of the only confirmed godly being in Berserk, Void's power extended far beyond any spirit or angel the mages of Elfhelm could think of, and the separation of the worlds allowed him to start working on his grand plan. Geyseric had claimed his kingdom with blood and tried homogenizing multiple diverse cultures and identities in a single lifetime. Void saw the consequences of that for the people and the king himself. Cause and effect brought them to the point evil cracked a hole open in reality itself, and by gazing into that abyss, he finally saw the truth of it all. He knew the human will and understood that in order to subsume it within the current of causality, a single eclipse was not going to cut it. Choice played a role in one's fate as much as precognition did, but to make his plans foolproof, he had to eliminate the former as being an option. He'd need agents all over the globe who worked to erode the faith of mankind in nature's spirits until they all came to worship a single god, because 1,000 years after his birth, that god would take him to his personal glory. Now that he'd set the stage, Void needed to acquire the players, and for the next 1,000 or so years, he does just that. The Archangel and his fellow kinsmen, the God Hand structure at the beginning of the series. As the first member of the elusive God Hand, Void had a much deeper understanding of and appreciation for the concept of causality. Causality is presented as a transcendental truth that spans across all space and time, born as a consequence of humanity's collective desire for reasons beyond the evident. Causality governs the fate of most men, pointing them in the direction it wants them to walk toward. However, as a metaphysical entity, Void can no longer do said pointing physically. He needs to guide mankind toward evil without letting them know he is the one doing it. Because as we mentioned in our previous segment, choice is an important aspect of destiny. When Void was presented with the option to perish because of his torture or transcend it and become a god, he chose the latter because he knew it was what Geyseric aspired to be seen as. No one conquers the entire planet and doesn't develop a god complex because of it. The Valyrians acquired it after annexing about a third of the known world in the Song of Ice and Fire universe. They had a lot more time on their hands. To think that Geyseric came to see himself as above regular men is not too much of a stretch to us, especially because it makes Void's current divine status make total sense. It was his final option to impress his superiority over Geyseric as a human being, and when you've suffered for months on end at the hands of a man you can now revenge yourself upon, well, would you pass up that choice? Void took everything Geyseric held dear by claiming the lives of his citizens and his beloved priestess. But once that was done, his purpose shifted to enlightenment. He wanted the whole world to experience the unfiltered truth like he had, so he got to work on preparing the apparatus through which he could achieve that goal. For starters, the appropriate context needed to be established so the world would accept the God Hands favored as their savior, way down the line. This context could only be established by manipulating bloodlines, religions, cultures, and history itself, all of which the God Hand ends up doing, starting with the establishment of the Holy See. For a faith that's supposed to mirror Christianity, the sea has an odd religious symbol because it's as disconnected from the Christian cross as is humanly possible. In Berserk, the symbol of Christianity is a white falcon in flight, rising out of a double helix formation. Now, sure, There can be a biblical falcon that flew Berserk Jesus away from humanity's sins and was therefore commemorated as the symbol of the religion. But readers of the manga know that's not the case. This falcon is a literal representation of Griffith's rebirth as Femto, which you can decipher from the imagery employed. The falcon is Griffith's personal sigil, and the double helix is most associated with the idea of evil in Berserk. This means that the Holy See itself was a bit of a plant, making all the things that its practitioners did following its establishment indirectly align with the will of the God Hand. It makes a lot of sense why things like torture and frequent witch hunts and burnings were commonplace for the sea, because such things created malaise that the God Hand could then manipulate through the subconscious mind. If you've ever wondered what sense Mosgus's torture regimens made when attempting to reform the faithless, well, you now know that it was basically God's plan. Besides, promoting violence as the only means for creating obedience, the Holy See also rather conveniently erected churches over the shrines of nature spirits so as to crush their influence altogether. Only in remote parts of the world, like the Kushan Empire and Isma's Island, did the touch of the sea not proliferate too. The Kushan continue to worship their own gods, inspired by the Hindu pantheon, which were closer to the nature spirits of old. The people of Isma's Island worship the sea god, a dark, malevolent Cthulhu-esque being. Apart from these two territories, the rest of the world adhered to the sea, which made them prime targets for God Hand manipulation. By stamping out sanctuaries for those who can oppose them and promoting ideals that feed their power, the God Hand set up a system geared toward ensuring their eventual takeover of the world. Or rather, we should say, Void did. For the first 2 centuries or so of his new existence, Void was the only demon king occupying that iconic hand of God. He knew from the very beginning that in order to make the idea of evil the ruling force of the world, the rest of the fingers needed to be filled. That kind of an undertaking took time and preparation. The Crimson Behelit only appeared on Earth once in 2 centuries, so Void had at least 2 centuries to fill in the meantime. He occupied himself by facilitating the conversion of humans into a lesser form of demon through a lesser form of the Crimson Behelit, aka birthing apostles. Like we mentioned at the beginning of this segment, relativity and the space-time continuum play a huge role in the God Hand's existence. Behelits are the perfect example of this because they're keys that link the physical world to another dimension, provided certain conditions are fulfilled. A regular Behelit doesn't pull one soul into the abyss, at least not immediately. Instead, it bequeaths them with a portion of its power in exchange for the souls of those closest to them. This doesn't require them to sacrifice entire cities, thus limiting the scope of their power, but the deal itself is still spiritually significant. By accepting Void's offer and becoming a demon, a human being unwittingly strengthens the vortex of tortured souls, that is, Berserk's version of hell. An apostle's actions only bring misery upon those who encounter them, and unlike Void, they can actually operate in the physical world. Their souls, along with those they sacrifice, contribute to its endless swells and make it stronger than one can comprehend. For the first couple of centuries, the Archangel of Demonkind worked on perfecting both the subliminal messaging with which he wanted the world to prepare for his takeover, as well as the agents of chaos that he can unleash upon it to influence events more directly. The latter was more easily achieved, for he'd already done it once. He just needed to adjust for scale. The invocation of doom is the process by which Void formally begins his target's transition from human to demon, and it starts with greeting the person. Once they've been greeted, Void explains to them how they've arrived within the interstice and promises to take away all their pain and despair in exchange for a single phrase. Once that phrase has been uttered, performs the invocation of doom and brands the intended victim or victims with the brand of sacrifice. As he does this, the Behelit opens a fissure in the ritual invoker's heart, which fills with the power of evil. It's sealed when they consume their sacrifice, thus cementing their connection to the vortex of soul. The sacrifices end up in it as soon as they're devoured. The apostles join them once they're killed as well. Over the course of a millennium, Void must have performed this ceremony thousands of times, contributing hundreds of thousands of souls to the vortex, if not millions. This made his power base strong enough to give us the most iconic Berserk panel not committed to film, that being this shot of the abyss from the Guardian Angels of Desire, Part 6. You really get a sense of the endlessness of Miura's hell from that one panel, and then Guts nearly getting sucked into it shows you how determined it is to expand its ranks constantly. With the second half of his mission accomplished, Void needed a way to bring humanity towards his way of thinking in a way that was as natural as it was choice-based, and this is where the rest of his kinsmen come in. Over the course of the next 600 years, Void performs the invocation of doom for the bearer of a crimson behelit thrice, bringing Ubik, Slan, and Conrad into the fold as God Hand members. Each of them represents a rather unique place in the pantheon of evil, which makes them perfect agents for global manipulation. As the embodiment of pestilence, Conrad could cause plagues on command, spreading death and despair through disease, and giving the God Hand additional souls to feed off at a much quicker pace. A neat side effect was being able to pen up people in regions where the God Hand's influence was at its peak, which you'll learn soon enough why that is so important. As the embodiment of sin, Slan manipulated the lust and desire within people's hearts and minds to get them to cast off all worldly inhibitions and devote themselves solely to depravity. This made them more susceptible to suggestion, thus allowing her to influence them as directly as is God-handedly possible. Ubik uses the God Hand's control over space-time to tear open a hole within the consciousness of a ritual invoker, and then manipulates them into making the right choice. The delight he takes in doing this is perverse, but his impact is certainly noticeable, and Void clinches the deal by performing the Invocation of Doom, which seals said invoker's fate, putting it firmly in the hands of demons. With each God Hand member's birth, Void makes his conversion formula even better and gains that much more influence over the human subconscious. With his team of 4 assembled after 800 years of preparation, he gets to work on the final phase of the God Hand cycle, and the first phase in bringing the Age of Darkness, paving the path for Griffith's ascension. Just before the 4th eclipse, Void and his kinsmen create Nosferatu Zod, the strongest and oldest known apostle in the series. After the 4th eclipse, they convert honorable warriors like Grunbeld and Locust to their cause, by exploiting the darkness that always lurked within them. They created the best possible army of thralls by deliberately targeting nobles like Slugcount and the Snake Baron, as well as the aforementioned generals, because when the time came, they'd need a force hardwired to be loyal to them. The God Hand had done its best to hijack the Holy See and spread its influence through them, but the human spirit ultimately remains free in nature. Even when chanting the name of the same God, no two schools of Christianity are alike, and in the end, there's always the risk of turning people into non-believers by making one's religion harsher than it need be. The loyalty of humanity couldn't be bought on a large scale or encoded into their DNA, so apostles needed to become the unflinching soldiers of the Age of Darkness. Most apostles were base monsters that sought only to indulge their desires, so they'd need actual war generals to keep them in line by the time their rightful king was born. Once they had all the kinks sorted out and their ducks in a row, Void began working on the most important target of his entire operation. Final year off said target's imprisonment, he greenlit the act upon which his master's hopes and dreams were hinged. Project Falcon. The conductor of the eclipse. Void's role in Griffith's ascension. Everything that Void has worked toward, the moment he was given this new life to the moment the series entered the current timeline, has been geared toward a single goal: ensuring Griffith becomes his final kinsman. From planting his image as the symbol of the Holy See to creating circumstances ripe for him to exploit as a mercenary leader, everything that's happened in Griffith's life has been guided by the idea of evil, by extension, Void himself. If he was a more cautious child, he'd have returned the mysterious stone he got from the random gypsy woman who told him it'd give him the world in exchange for his flesh. At the time, Griffith was a boy with a man's ambition, but a boy nonetheless, so probably just took those words as a street haggler's personal sales pitch. He's never shown a sign of true piety in his entire life, but that's because he's always been a part of the God Hand's plan. They didn't make themselves known to their final kinsman directly, but they revealed themselves to him through their greatest agent of all, Zod. When Zod was put in Griffith's path during his campaign for the Midlanders during the 100-Year War, to us it felt like a random nightmare, but to him it was destiny. 2 centuries had passed since the last God Hand was born, and the time for the eclipse was arriving in less than a decade. The Chosen One was going to reveal himself sooner or later, and turns out it was the former, because Zod figured out Griffith is the 5th in the 5th chapter of Berserk. From that moment, he did everything in his power to bring Griffith to his greatest glory, so he could fall into the pits of despair. Zod was directly involved in the White Falcon's most important strategic victory as a part of Midland's military complex. The fortress of Daldry was the catalyst for the conflict between Midland and Tudor, and for 100 years it had been in enemy hands, thanks to its near-impregnable position and defences. Retaking Daldry would effectively win Midland the war, which is why Griffith decided he needed to be the one to do it. His plan was going swimmingly until his greatest asset found himself flat on his ass with a broken sword and a dagger to defend himself. Guts had lost his initial exchange with the Tudor General Buscoin thanks to a banged-up weapon. If he didn't find something big enough to replace it, he was dead meat, and so was Griffith's dream. Zod knew that he couldn't let that happen to a future sacrifice, not to mention his own future master, so he threw his sword into the mix, which secured the victory for the Falcons. He started rounding up apostles in anticipation of Griffith's rebirth, and when the Falcon was imprisoned and tortured like Void was 1,000 years ago, the God Hand finally made direct contact. In Chapter 49 of Berserk, Griffith has spent a year in torment. His mind is beginning to crack. He thinks to himself why Guts is the only person that succeeds in making him so compulsive, and yet his only sliver of hope within this desolation. How long ago did someone who was supposed to be in his hands gain such a firm grasp over him? The Falcon admits that the longer he's imprisoned, the more his dream fades, being replaced by the image of Guts, and it's at this moment that the barriers between the physical and astral crack open for him. A brick is loosened from his cell wall, hundreds of feet below the earth, and from the gap emerge monstrous-looking spirits that reach out to him. Griffith seems scared at first, but his expression changes when he hears the voices call him Prince. They tell him that they seek an audience with him in time at that place, and inform him that they are kinsmen, dubbing him the Blessed King of Longing. While this happens, we see silhouettes of the God Hand in a room that appears quite similar to the one from their debut appearance in The Black Swordsman. We'll talk about that in a few minutes as well, seeing as it was his last canonical appearance. So, this brief appearance from the God Hand works in keeping Griffith's life alive enough to coast him over to the eclipse site. Along the way, he received multiple reminders why his dream was dead. His hatred for Guts grew even stronger, seeing his unbelievable growth as a swordsman. Could have tried making peace with this situation if he was given time. Fortunately for the God Hand, even a rogue element within their ranks can end up contributing to their grand plan, and that's exactly what ends up happening when Griffith meets Wild. The leader of Midland's Black Dog Knights was only interested in enjoying life and exciting himself up until Zod told him about the eclipse and who was gonna be its target. Wild knew of Griffith's reputation as one of Midland's top commanders. He was fully aware of his current existential state. He had a detailed report on every way the jailer of the Tower of Rebirth had mutilated and abused Griffith for some reason, and he wanted to make the escaping Falcon his pièce de résistance. Wild couldn't get through Guts to turn Griffith into his prey, so he settled for humiliation. On the verge of death, he grabbed the Falcon and frantically began searching for his behelit to give himself a supposed way out. Wild might have been a brute, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that a behelit gave him his current life. It could also potentially save him from dying, but first he needed to find one. Griffith didn't have his on him. This sent Wild into a rage that caused him to expose the Falcon's physical deformities to his soldiers, wiping out any hopes of the band soaring through battlefields once again. Before he could kill Griffith, Zod arrived, killed him instead, and gave Griffith the most direct hint that something greater was afoot with his life. He told him that his behelit would return to him when he needed it the most, because that's how it worked. One failed attempt at sleeping with Casca later, Griffith decided to see what that meant for himself and set off for the site of his eclipse. He was guided there by a vision of his past selves that encouraged him to keep fighting for his dream. In reality, this could have been a hallucination or one of Ubik's tricks on display. Either way, it got Griffith where he needed to be, and when he couldn't even take his own life because of his powerlessness, he decided to transcend it by taking the lives of those he loved. Before he made that decision, though, he was scared, and understandably so, because his world had just been shattered, metaphorically and literally. Griffith had lost the ability to fulfill his dream as a human being, and at the moment he desired an escape from his pain and suffering, he was pulled into a dimension composed entirely of tortured faces. 4 towering demonic beings emerged in the background, while he himself was being flanked by scores of apostles. His team had barely managed to defeat one of them, and at the beginning of the eclipse, they were still his team. Griffith was actually comforted by Guts' presence in the interstice, no matter how badly he wanted to get away from him moments ago, because when the God Hand tried convincing him he was a demon, the guy stood up for him. You can see a look of shocked appreciation cross his face in Chapter 75 when Guts calls out the God Hand for lumping him in with themselves when he didn't so much as have a tail. Griffith instinctively reaches out for Guts when the God Hand tries to separate them because he's scared of everything that's happening and he was barely holding on as it is. But the God Hand knew this just as well and needed to capitalize on it before it was too late. Choice is an important ingredient that needs to be added to the causal cauldron. If Griffith remained with his soldiers in his current emotional state, he could end up rejecting the God Hand's offer, derailing their entire plan for the world. But that was never going to happen because Void wouldn't let it. He started off the festivities of the eclipse by first addressing the lambs of the unholy god born of man, the Apostles. He welcomed them to the great nocturnal feast and charged them with enjoying it to the fullest. He then addressed Griffith directly as the honoured guest of the festivities, the one in whose name they had gathered. He informed him that they were kinsmen, but before he could go any further, Guts began chiming in. Void let Ubik and Slan do the exposition while he prepared himself for the main show, which was convincing Griffith to accept the deal and join his group. When Guts kept trying to argue back, even after being told that Griffith would serve him up as a sacrifice willingly, Void declared that all their lives had been woven together to come to this moment that the time was at hand. Conrad separated his future kinsman from the rest of his soldiers by raising him on an altar of faces, but he didn't succeed entirely. Guts, the annoying gnat that he is, held on to him, but his grip was broken by Griffith's fragile body. The Falcon couldn't even reinforce his hold on him because his wrist tendons had been severed, which led to Guts sliding down a mountain of faces as Griffith was taken to its summit. By the time he stabbed his way to the top, it was too late because the God Hand had removed any doubt from his old friend's heart. As soon as Guts and Griffith were separated, Void asked the latter why one such as him was afraid of extraordinary beings like them. Was he truly afraid of the God Hand or the future that awaited him? As if on cue, Ubik swoops in and does his mental projection thing, bringing Griffith to the edge of believing that he'd always been a stone-cold killer. And then Void closes the deal. He tells Griffith that what he saw, courtesy of Ubik, was no illusion. That was his true self that lay deep within his unconscious mind. Void made him realize and embrace the fact that he'd piled up thousands of corpses to get to where he was that day, to keep doing it to achieve his goal, because that's the kind of man he was. Slan chimes in and adds that he could reject their deal, and his soldiers would eventually forgive him too. That would mean killing his dream as well. Void picked up where she left off and told Griffith that if that castle still shined in his eyes more dazzling than anything, well, then all he needs to do is say the words, and he'll be granted raven black wings with which he can soar to summits higher than any he could have previously imagined. This does it for him, and Griffith accepts the God Hand's deal, chanting the words and making the sacrifice. When he emerges, reborn as Femto, the rest of the God Hand rejoices, except for Void, who maintains his stoic expression. Perhaps that's because he was waiting to see how his new kinsman would react to his power, but we think it had more to do with him knowing Skull Knight was gonna show up anytime soon. He did, but not soon enough, and though Void's latest kinsman was denied the souls of 2 of his sacrifices, the rest of them were more than enough. With Griffith's birth, the Age of Darkness could finally be brought to the world, and as far as the manga is concerned, that was the last time we saw Void in the flesh. But yet to see him make a full appearance since Griffith's eclipse. But to be fair to the guy, his job was done when the Falcon accepted his offer. The revelations say that when the sun dies 5 times, a red lake will appear west of a city with a name both old and new. It's a sign that the 5th angel will alight. He is the Falcon of Darkness, the king of the blind white sheep and the master of the sinful black sheep. He will usher in an age of darkness. This is a warning that is recorded in the scriptures of the Holy See itself, perhaps as a fail-safe in case the plan ever becomes too dangerous, but it's brought into play well after the God Hand has already made its most important move. Ensuring Griffith's rebirth was the most important step in making this prophecy come true, because the rest, well, his very nature as a God Hand would allow him to accomplish. Void is seen a grand total of 2 times after the eclipse. Once when the God Hand partially manifests during the incarnation ceremony, and again when Griffith triggers the great roar of the astral world, returning Earth to a state of fantasia. Both appearances are really brief, but they occur at some of the most important temporal junction points in the series, far more important than the eclipse. The incarnation ceremony was basically an inversion of Void's sacrificial ritual, orchestrated with the sole purpose of putting a god hand into a body of flesh. Though the sacrifices he used this time around weren't marked with the brand of sacrifice, they ended up becoming fodder, just like the old Band of the Falcon during the eclipse, all so it could bring literal evil into the world. Once that evil arrived, it immediately got to work on positioning itself as the only capable and possible savior of the world, using the many contexts that had been laid for him over the centuries. Griffith used his status as the savior of Midland from the 100-Year War and his kinsman Ubic's mental projections from the Revelations chapters to portray himself as the prophesied savior, when in truth, he was the harbinger of doom. He created a new Band of the Falcon with apostles as his core soldiers and set about gathering human subjects for his future kingdom. In his crusade to liberate Midland and Holy See territory from invading Kushan forces, Griffith got himself formally proclaimed as the messianic savior by Berserk's. This, combined with his betrothal to Charlotte, gave him a secure path to the throne and a means to directly shape its future. Once he'd done that, he needed to wait until the right moment for the merger, which presented itself to him atop the head of Shiva, Ganishka. All that was left was to bring the world to a position where it played by his terms, and that is exactly what he accomplished. The Dread Emperor had undergone a second reincarnation upon realizing that he can never hope to defeat a god hand in a straight fight, but he inadvertently ended up helping his enemy instead. His body, which was overflowing with abyssal energy, might have broken his mind, but in the right hands, it could break the world. As it just so happens, Femto was the man with those hands, and break the world he did, with a little help from Skull Knight himself. The Wandering Wraith's failed ambush attempt with his fancy sword of actuation gave Femto all the ingredients he needed to reverse what his predecessor did 1,000 years ago. You might be asking yourself, well, why would he do that if he was already untouchable in the material plane? When Femto returned as Griffith, he brought all his powers as a god hand with him. Spatial and gravity manipulation, flight, spiritual communion, you name it. He's basically Berserk Jesus, except he's no son of God, and he definitely didn't suffer for the sins of mankind. Could have just kept on cosplaying as such, and he still would have become the ruler of Earth, because as a god hand with body of flesh, he was the absolute. The reason he needed to take the world back to a state of fantasia was because even though he was God on Earth, he had no control over said Earth. In an unmerged state, the physical world posed more of a threat to him than it gave him opportunities. Griffith's main army was composed of apostles, and though most of his military engagements didn't require them to assume their true forms, he knew he couldn't hide their true nature from his human followers forever. He needed to create a world with such an impossible rate of survival that working alongside monsters made sense to them. If they started doubting his true nature and goals, his entire plan would come undone, and it nearly did when he engaged Ganishka in their final battle. When his war demons took their released forms to battle Ganishka's pseudo-spawns, Griffith's human followers briefly questioned why he was working alongside such demons, and whether he was a demon himself. Sonya came to his rescue and reinforced his will over all of them, and that was a close call. Luckily, he won't have another, because now he lives in a world where dragons and hydras can attack people at any time, and his war demons are more necessary than ever before. So, acclimating his intended subjects to the truth about his forces was one reason he needed the merger to happen, but the bigger reason was to gain full control of everything on Earth. The entire basis for a magician's power, be they good or evil, comes from the Garden of Spirit Trees, which resides within the astral world. This garden is where every single spirit tree takes root and grows into a magical power source. Most spirit trees in Berserk are located in sanctuaries where the interstice is always active and always protected by a guardian of the tree. But because these guardians' ideologies directly oppose Griffith's, he needs to eliminate them, ensure that only one spirit tree remained in either world, the one that he had control over. By killing Ganishka with a spatial sword stroke connected to the abyss, Griffith merged the physical and astral worlds once again and turned the Dread Emperor's corpse into his power conductor. Ganishka became the World Tree, which represents all the pathways of the astral world with its branches and supports all life on them as well. Right now, Griffith has managed to eliminate not only Flora, but also Elfhelm, whose cherry blossom spirit tree was one of the biggest opposing forces to his world tree. The garden itself has been nearly reduced to ash, with Ganishka's corpse as its only prominent resident. This has given Griffith and his kinsmen full control of the world, and now truly shape it in whatever way they see fit. Void has finally defeated his arch-enemy completely, and to add insult to injury, it took his help to do it. Seeing a God Hand member ruling from the ruins of his old city because he wasn't fast enough to escape Griffith's spatial manipulation must be making his dead soul seethe with rage. It's bloody ironic the Skull Knight was the one who made the Great Roar of the Astral World possible, when he's been doing everything he can to prevent it for 1,000 years. And maybe that's where his story with Void ends. The Archangel of the God Hand has done everything in his power to ensure that his master's will was the only thing that permeated the world. And to an extremely large extent, he's accomplished that. Falconia is the beating heart of the idea of evil, and the fact that it stands upon the city that he once loved must make his exposed mind feel somewhat nostalgic. Speaking of exposed minds, that's the form Void chooses for his physical manifestation in chapter 306, now that he too is a part of the physical world. We imagine he'll take on his proper appearance and show up near the end of the show to gloat about his victory to Skull Knight. But there's just this one thing that keeps us up at night. Comes to Void. Why is he lying to his kinsman? The only one that can fully interpret causality's will is Void hiding information from his kinsman. How will his story end? The biggest asset in the God Hand's arsenal is their ability to see the fate of people. The interpretation of causality is the God Hand experience all of space-time at the same moment, thus allowing them to foresee which events are most likely to occur, making them appear omniscient. However, by their own admission, they are not gods themselves, so their scope of interpretation is limited. They can foresee most things that occur at a temporal junction, but they can't foresee everything. This is evidenced by the fact that Ubik, Slan, and Conrad were delightfully surprised that Guts managed to survive the eclipse. Not only that, he escaped with his lover still alive. This was a most unexpected thing to them, because throughout all their interpretations, they never saw this coming. But something tells us that Void did, because he remained silent throughout that escape sequence, as if he knew it needed to happen. Being the first person to transcend mortality, it makes sense to us that Void's interpretation of causality makes him borderline clairvoyant. Unlike his kinsman, he's had 1,000 years to work on it, and he seems to be way more in tune with the idea of evil. The rest of the God Hand often professes personal ambitions during their rituals, which makes them a lot more selfish. Ubik loves toying with his victims' minds, and that's his true motivator for manipulating their subconscious, not the fulfillment of causality's designs. Slan has expressed her desire to make Guts one of them on multiple occasions, even though she knows it's not meant to be, because she has taken a liking to him. Femto does everything he does to realize his childhood dream, but Void, well, he's the preacher of the gospel of evil. He's the only God Hand member that makes overt references to the idea of evil during the rituals, and he even calls its grace cruel. When he works on convincing Griffith to join his side, Void tells him that if it is reason that makes destiny transcend human intellect and make playthings of humans, then it's cause and effect that a human bears their evil and confronts their destiny head-on. The Archangel of Evil knows that causality is ultimately a choice, and he's perfected the art of making that choice look like inevitability. When he says that all lies within the current of causality, he isn't lying. He's just glossing over what makes that box tick, is all. It's classic manipulation by omission, and if he does it to his targets, then who's to say he isn't doing it to his kinsman? When Skull Knight leaves with 2 of his sacrifices, instead of trying to stop him with his spatial powers, which he could have easily done, Void lets him go. Strange. That, considering they're supposed to be locked in a centuries-long blood feud. While Ubik claps at the utter unpredictability of such an occurrence, Slan has a more tempered outlook. She reminds him of their limitations with respect to seeing the future, and then wonders out loud if even this was a part of the plan. The panel from chapter 88, which depicts this scene, has her standing in the background, while Void stands in the foreground in stony silence. Miura then gives us a close-up of his face, as if to say, yes, it was needed. The 1997 anime adaptation of Berserk took this one step further, and Haslan directly asked Void if that was the case, only to receive his cold shoulder in response. While she never gets her answer, Void's silence is loud enough for us to get Miora's meaning, and it also confirms that there's a gulf between his interpretation of causality and that of his kinsman. His kinsman can only decipher the outlines of causality, whereas he can see the finer detail. The reason he let all three of them escape was probably because he knew they'd be useful to him down the line. Guts and Casca were needed to trigger the blood flow of the dead during the incarnation ceremony. More specifically, their brands were. Without the presence of two brands of sacrifice, we doubt the malaise surrounding the Tower of Conviction would have gained a form as strong as it did in the series. Skull Knight was also a part of causality's design, because this sort of actuation would undo what Void's special powers did 1,000 years ago. So when Slan says that escape was probably also a part of the plan, she has no idea how right she is. The thing that bothers us is Void's deliberate choice to not share his knowledge with his kinsman. The God Hand appear to be a proper unit when they materialize during demonic rituals. While the series has progressed, the clearer it's become that all of them merely cooperate with each other in pursuit of their own goals. Void is the only one truly serving the idea of evil, so maybe that's the reason he can foresee even the leaping of a fish that's half a step outside the world of reason. As a branded individual in the physical world, Guts existed in the interstices for the most part, despite having a physical body. This made him the most unpredictable factor in causality's grand design, because it gave him the power to step outside of its purview. Time and again, the Black Swordsman has defeated death when death seemed inevitable, and his actions have ensured that the God Hand's plans don't proceed exactly how they want them to. The incarnation ceremony gets cocked up by his demon child, who manages to find its way into Griffith's new body, thus creating a fatal vulnerability within him. And the Great Roar of the Astral World gets delayed because Guts gets to the slug count before the God Hand does. Ganishka was not the first choice for a second reincarnation, but the God Hand had to make do with him because that was their only option. Had things gone the way they wanted them to, they'd have a twice reincarnated apostle that was completely loyal to them, because slug count was tipped for that job. This is where we address what we were trying to tell you about Void's perception of causality earlier. The slug count encounter proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he could see not just his glory, but his failures as well. When the Count activated his Behelit a second time and summoned the God Hand to help him escape death and defeat the Black Swordsman at the same time, he inexplicably dragged the swordsman into the interstice with him and his daughter. Maybe this happened because Guts was already branded and thus an offering to the Vortex of Souls. But regardless of the how or why, gave him what he'd always wanted. Bloody reunion with Griffith. Despite his broken body and hand, which prevented him from getting a proper grip on Dragon Slayer, Guts lunged for Griffith the first chance he got. The rest of the God Hand wrote him off for being a mere mortal who was unaware of the life-threatening pain his brand would make him experience in their presence. But Void didn't. He kept his eyes glued on the Black Swordsman as he recovered from nearly passing out and swung his slab of iron at his kinsman. He knew that Gus wouldn't be deterred by a thing as trivial as pain. He also knows when destiny takes hold and when it doesn't, which is evidenced by him cancelling the Count's second incarnation before he even has a chance to give an answer. Throughout the final 2 chapters of the Black Swordsman arc, the God Hand presses the Count into sacrificing his daughter and being reincarnated again, so he'd fully sever his human weaknesses and avenge all fallen apostles by killing Gus. The Count wanted the God Hand to kill Gus for him. He was informed that things didn't work that way. He was their thrall, not the other way around. He wanted to keep living. He'd have to sacrifice his daughter. After much intimidation and manipulation, which involved Ubik exposing his first sacrificial offering's identity to his daughter, the Count nearly gave in to his overlord's demands and chanted the words. He could feel the warmth of life slipping out of his cold body, and with hell lurking in the background, all he could think of was how to escape it. Void had the brand of sacrifice queued up for the moment the Count caved was waving it in front of Teresia. But just when he should have said, "I sacrifice," he instead chose to bear his destiny head on. The Count was dissuaded from giving up the last shred of his humanity by the sight of his crying daughter, whom he wanted to protect more than anything. If he sacrificed her, he'd be condemning her soul to hell, and she didn't deserve that. Unlike her mother, the father in him won over the demon in him, and as soon as Void sensed this, he rescinded the brand and declared that the thread of fate had been severed. The Vortex of Souls then claims Slug Count's soul, and it tries to take Guts as well, but he manages to free himself with a cannon shot. It's curious that despite getting the chance to complete his sacrifice, Griffith makes no move to do so, instead taking a defensive stance in Guts' presence. This is not to say he was worried he'll get defeated on offense, considering Guts couldn't even touch him. It's to show how inferior Griffith thought Guts was now in comparison to himself. To be fair, we've already laid out why he was spared in this moment, considering the incarnation ceremony hadn't occurred yet from a chronological perspective. But Void's silence is louder than a fighter jet taking off in this encounter. He knows something about Guts' future, regards to the God Hand's plans for the world, and he isn't telling anyone else. Maybe because he knows doing so wouldn't help him either way. As a leaping fish, Guts was inherently outside the flow of causality, and the only thing that kept him tethered to it was his over-attachment to Griffith. Throughout his entire journey from Godot's ore mine to the island where Elfhelm is located, Guts professed several goals, the most prominent one being keeping Casca safe. But his true ambition had always been tracking down Griffith and giving him a taste of revenge. Even when he's taking Casca to Elfhelm, all he's thinking about is if Griffith shows up, he'll abandon everything just to try and murk him. This desire for vengeance has clouded his judgment more times than he'd care to admit. He figures out that letting go of it is the key to defeating his enemy. Void's plans will be in grave danger. Maybe he's keeping a closer watch on Guts than any of us realize, and maybe the reason we saw Guts floating inside a very deep layer of the astral world in Chapter 376 is because Void pulled him there. This hasn't been explained yet. It happened in the last chapter of Berserk, but at the beginning of Chapter 376, we see Guts' astral body being swept away by a torrent. He's completely inept in the face of its force, and the sudden appearance from Shirka helps him anchor his soul to his body once again. There can be many interpretations as to what might have caused that, but the prime candidate in our eyes is the God Hand. Guts is not a practitioner of the spiritual arts. He's a warrior who makes use of spiritual objects to the best of his abilities, and yet somehow his luminous body found itself caught up within a torrential layer of the astral world, as though it was getting sucked into the abyss. If Shirka did indeed save his life, then it makes sense that the ones wanting to take it would be related to the God Hand. As far as Void is concerned, his story with Geyserich is dead and buried, because he's chewed him up and spat him out and used him to further his own goal. The Supreme King wanted a world full of sin and evil. Void had created that world now. Geyserich's punishment was to wander through it endlessly, trying to come up with a way to kill the unkillable. But the final chapter of his story with Guts is yet to be written. And then there's the little matter of him keeping secrets from his kinsmen. Void can clearly perceive causality better than the rest of the God Hand. Why does he keep letting mortals interfere in their business when he can realistically stop it from ever happening? Could it be that he's got some sort of nefarious plan for sacrificing them as well? After all, Griffith did once let slip that his ultimate goal was to turn all living things into a unified being. He said it to Mule Wolfflame in reference to where the souls of the dead go once he releases them, but we don't think he was just talking about the afterlife. The only way to truly control something down to the last molecule is to have full ownership of it, and that can only happen if the God Hand turns all living things into some sort of demonic hive mind. If that comes to pass, then Void will have achieved Geyserich's ultimate goal for unity, while eliminating the one thing that posed an obstacle to him as well, that being free will. In the end, God Hand's agenda is to dictate the terms of human life, and Void is the prime example of that ideology. Whenever someone tries to refute the permanence of causality in his presence, he makes his voice louder and proclaims that causality is concrete. Void knows damn well that it isn't, but he has to make it seem like it is, so he can trick people into thinking choice is an illusion. Most of the world has bought into that idea and now follows one of his demonic kin, the ultimate chess move, if you ask us. By subsuming every consciousness that ever lived within the vortex of souls, including that of his kinsmen, Void will have achieved perfect harmony once and for all. All humans will share the same fate and occupy the same space without any sort of boundary to divide them from one another. But considering the fact that they'll all have to be in hell to achieve that uniformity, we're not sure just how much we want to see it happen. Still, we'd love to see how the story of Void, Griffith, and the two strugglers concludes, because that's what started this 1,000-year epic saga, and that's what will end it. Marvelous verdict. Whew. And that's it for our take on the entire life of Void. Let us know what you thought of it down in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, forget, keep struggling, strugglers. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.